Ladies and gentlemen, this is a Managing Violence podcast, FightBite! Hello everybody, welcome to the first ever Managing Violence podcast, FightBite. Now, what the idea of the FightBite is a short little snippet of a little bit of content from me, answering some of the common questions that come up that I see either directly sent to me, emailed to me, or potentially just stuff I see when I'm trolling the internet, looking at managing violence content, trying to find guests, or just reading up on what's going on out there. And I find a lot of common questions that, to be honest, the answers aren't that complicated, and they probably don't really need their own episode to address them. At least not a full hour-length interview with an expert. So I think there's a bunch of stuff we can get through in sort of short order to try and provide some value for those of you out there that may be new to this game, that are looking for some specific answers to some very specific questions. And I'm hopeful that's what we'll do with FightBite. So my intention is to give you real actionable content. And look, if you're a subscriber to the podcast, a subscriber to the YouTube channel, make sure you press the subscribe button. I'm not sure if it's up here. I think it's up here. If it's up here, great. Make sure you hit the subscribe button and follow along. And look, maybe you'll learn a thing or two, or if nothing else, maybe it'll be entertaining. Okay, the FightBite question for today is, what is the best martial art for self-defense? Wow. This question has been debated pretty much since the beginning of time. Well, at least since there was more than one martial art. Whenever Ugg the caveman developed his own system that was different from Nog the caveman system, they started arguing over who was better. It was easier back then because they could just fight to the death and whoever won had the better system. So that was much simpler. These days, a little bit more litigious. It's a little bit harder to do those sorts of things. So let's have a bit of a dive into this. What's the best martial art for self-defense? I see it asked over and over from well-meaning people. I'd like to think it's not experienced martial artists that are asking this question, because the more experience you get, the more you realize that one, no one really cares what you think. Two, there's not really a clear answer. And three, as long as you're enjoying what you're doing, then who really cares? But for new people that are looking to defend themselves, looking to learn some valuable skills, and they want to make sure they're on the right path, this is an important question. So let's have a look at it. What I'm going to do is I'm going to unpack the most common responses, so the arts that come up the most, give you my take on it as someone who has studied most of the arts in question to some degree, some of them more than others, and I'll be open and transparent about that. But certainly someone who I feel like I have a pretty good understanding of what real violence is and what prepares people to manage real violence. So let me see if I can provide some insight here. So the most common response for the best art to manage violence, or the best art to learn for self-defense, one of the top two is Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu. So Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, BJJ, for those of you who are completely unfamiliar, it is a grappling system, predominantly a grappling system, which in its modern incarnation focuses about 80% of its time on the ground, fighting on the ground. It was created in Brazil in the early 1900s. It became popular when Royce Gracie dominated the first few UFCs in the early 1990s, and the UFC was actually created by the Gracie family as a marketing tool to demonstrate their art to the world. And it worked beautifully, because it suddenly became one of the most popular and commercially successful martial arts in history. So look, Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu is a fantastic art. Some of the things that it does really well from a self-defense point of view. Firstly, you train against resistance pretty much from day one. So certainly when I started Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, which was in the early 2000s, everyone that trained was a fighter. So from day one, you were fighting. You were live grappling against resistance, even if you were a white belt. These days, Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu is much more a recreational activity for a lot of people. So you may not grapple straight away. You might be just doing drills for the first couple of months, and then eventually you'll get into it. But if you stick around for the art and you stick around for a while, it won't be long before you're doing live resistance. Live resistance is one of the keys to effective self-defense training. So if you're not doing live resistance, you're missing out, and pretty much whatever you're doing is less effective than it could be. So one thing Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu does really well is it gets you used to live resistance, it gets you used to being uncomfortable, it gets you used to pain, it gets you used to claustrophobic situations, it can help you overcome stress and fear and anxiety. It's certainly really good for your fitness because, again, you're practicing against live resisting opponents, so really good for that. And look, it is true that fights do often go to the ground, and if you know what you're doing on the ground, you have an advantage in a one-on-one fight. The key there is one-on-one fight. Fighting on the ground against multiple people is usually not advisable. When I say usually, like pretty much never advisable. As someone who has had my head kicked in and had my nose broken and been bottled because I took someone to the ground during a fight when I thought it was one-on-one, or I thought I had a numbers advantage and I didn't, I can verify that that wasn't a good idea. But that is the limitation of Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, the way it is taught in most schools. There are some Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu schools that do focus more on the self-defense side of the martial art, but most now focus on the sportive side or the MMA side, which is much more focused on closing distance, taking someone to the ground, controlling them on the ground, either inflicting damage or then applying a submission hold to win a fight. Submission holds have limited applicability in the real world. If you're going to apply an arm lock or a leg lock on somebody in the street, and I hate that term, the street, but you know what I mean, in the real world, you better be prepared to break that arm or break that leg, because if they're going to tap out and you let them go, then what was the point of that? So you need to be sure that you are legally justified and you are ethically justified in maiming this person and causing them a serious injury, because, well, if you're not, you're going to have a world of trouble afterwards. So make sure that if you're applying joint locks, that you're willing to go through with the end result. Strangles and chokes are a different animal. They're usually relatively safe, although I would never say choke someone if you don't intend to ride the consequences of what happens if they don't wake up. But it is a nice equalizer. It doesn't matter what drugs you're on, it doesn't matter how much adrenaline you have. If your brain isn't getting oxygen, you're not staying conscious and you're no longer a threat. So strangles are a really good tool to have in your arsenal. But that said, you can never really be sure what condition your assailant or your attacker or your opponent is in. They're not necessarily a finely tuned, healthy athlete that's gone through medical checks before being allowed to compete against you, like they would in a sporting situation. So you might be dealing with someone who has a brain injury or someone who has a drug and alcohol issue, and depriving their brain of oxygen may cause them all sorts of complications. I strangled a number of people unconscious while back in my bouncing days, usually as a last resort to get control of someone who was otherwise not controllable. And there were a number of times where they took a much, much longer to wake up than what I expected. When I was training Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu and Judo and Japanese Jiu-Jitsu and doing strangles in training, if someone went out, they were nearly always awake within a couple of seconds. When I was bouncing, there were times where someone was out for over a minute. And let me tell you, during that minute, my life flashed before my eyes. So just be mindful of that. So limitations of Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu. The limitations are going to the ground is not always a viable strategy or not always a good strategy. However, if it does go to the ground and you have the ability to fight effectively on the ground, then that's a really good skill to have. Also, most Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu schools do focus on the sportive side, which is very different to real violence and real fighting. So just be aware of that. But on the positives, it's a really good, healthy culture in most Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu academies. And also, you'll learn to fight against resistance in the very early stages, which is fantastic. Because we're on Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, let's just talk about the parent art of Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, which is Judo. If you've listened to the podcast, you know I'm predominantly a Judo guy. I've been doing Judo now for a lot of years, and that's what led me into Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu. Judo was the foundation of Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu before the Gracies modified it. Judo, very much the same sort of strengths and weaknesses as Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, except much more training time is spent standing up. So competing for throws, takedowns, etc., and then finishing the fight on the ground. I think Judo probably has the edge in self-defense for that reason over Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, because you can win fights with a throw, with a takedown on concrete quite easily, and doesn't rely on you necessarily going to the ground. That said, you still have the ability to break arms, break legs, and strangle someone quite effectively if you do go to the ground. And I think that's probably not a bad balance. That said, again, caveat always, is that when you are throwing someone onto concrete, you have to be very, very careful that you don't cause them very serious injury unless it's life or death. So I had to modify my judo quite substantially when I started bouncing, because I found that people, I had to be careful that people didn't bang their heads on concrete or on bar stools or on ledges or whatever as I was doing takedowns. So you have to be aware of that. It's a high impact art. The positives, just like Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, you will learn to fight against resistance very, very early. You'll learn to fall very well, which is a substantial skill to have. And you will also, again, have a quite healthy environment. That said, judo is very hard on your body. It's extremely difficult for adults to start and stick with, because it is painful. Look, it's rough. I won't lie. I wish I'd started when I was a child. I didn't. I started as a late teenager, and even that was quite late. Look, it's certainly worth having a look at. If you can stick with it, you'll get a lot of benefit out of it. While we're on the sporting arts, let's touch on boxing, Muay Thai, and MMA. So these are the other arts that are commonly thrown out there. Boxing, Muay Thai, MMA. So just quickly, everyone I hope knows what boxing is. But Muay Thai is Thai boxing, so it's like Western boxing, but with kicks, knees, elbows as well. It's a sporting style, the way it's commonly taught anyway. I know there is a combative element that isn't sporting, but the way Muay Thai is taught in, I would say, 99% of gyms, it is a sporting martial art. And lastly, MMA, mixed martial arts, UFC, etc. So let me just say, sporting arts in general. Okay, sorry, let me backtrack. Let's talk about boxing and Muay Thai separately, because we haven't talked about striking yet. Nothing will teach you how to strike well faster than boxing and Muay Thai. The ability to close distance or control distance, to keep distance, to use all your striking weapons, whether it be punches, kicks, knees, elbows, headbutts, etc. You'll be able to generate a lot of force, a lot of torque. You'll be able to use your footwork a lot better. You will hit with power so that when you hit people, they stay hit. Those are very, very good skills to have when it comes to defending yourself. The problem with striking systems from self-defense point of view, and the same as grappling has its limitations, and so does striking. The problem that striking systems have is that you don't really get to control what damage your strikes do. You never want to hit someone softly, ever. So you are hitting someone hard and then hoping that you are not going to do more damage than you intend to. Even a stiff jab, if it lands on the chin, can knock someone out standing, and then you'll find they're at the mercy of gravity and whatever might be behind them when their head smacks the ground. So a lot of well-intentioned people find themselves in a lot of hot water because they use their boxing or Muay Thai or MMA skills and knock someone out in a street fight and caused a unplanned, unintended head injury or even death. So be extremely careful with relying on striking as your primary for self-defense, unless you are only ever fighting when it's life or death. A lot of people will say, well, I only ever intend to get into a fight if it's life or death. Okay, cool. But just make sure you're aware of that limitation. The problem with any sporting system, whether it's BJJ, judo, Muay Thai, boxing, MMA, Kyokushin karate, Savate, whatever. The problem with all sporting martial arts when it comes to their applicability to self-defense is that they have inherent limitations based on rule set. We can't have people this isn't Rome. We can't just throw people into an auditorium and have them fight to the death. So we have to have rules to make it safe. We need to have rules and restrictions so that we can train safely, so that we can enjoy our martial art as a recreational activity, as well as a competitive activity, and keep things safe and civil. Because look, the vast majority of people that train in these arts still have to go to work on Monday morning, just like the rest of us. And we can't be going in with limbs broken and eyes missing and your testicles jammed inside your body. So we have to place limitations on what skills we practice so that it's safe and so we can keep practicing. And that's not a bad thing. All throughout history, military fighting systems have developed safe methods of practice so that soldiers could maintain some level of combat proficiency without injuring each other. And that's important. But we need to keep in mind that an MMA fight or UFC fight is not a street fight. No street fight starts with two guys getting into a fight and then agreeing to meet each other back here 3 months' time after a full training camp and a weight cut with coaches and cornermen and a referee and an established set of rules and prize money on the line. That's not reality. The reality of a real fight is it happens now when you're not prepared. No one picks a fight when you've just come out of the gym and you're all jacked up and you're ready to go and you've had a warm up and you're stretched. The fight happens when you are not ready for it. That's nearly always the way it happens. The reason you got picked is because you looked like an easy victim, not because you looked like you're ready to go 5 rounds with Conor McGregor. So just keep that in mind. Sport is not reality. There are certainly a lot of things we can gain from the sporting system, such as working against pressure, working against resistance, dealing with people actually trying to hurt you, actually trying to punch you, actually trying to kick you, actually trying to take you down. Dealing with all that is super important for effective self-defense. But there are limitations of sporting systems that make it, it's just not perfect. It's not perfect for self-defense, but few things are. Right, that's the sporting systems out of the way in general. Krav Maga. Krav Maga is probably the second most recommended system after Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu. I'm a Krav Maga instructor, so I am a little bit partial, but I'm also open-minded about it. So there's a lot of different Krav Magas. The original Krav Maga system was a short course format for training soldiers extremely quickly into how to protect themselves how to take out enemies in a hand-to-hand combat situation. So that system, brutal and effective for war, but probably wouldn't transplant very well into Australia or the UK or even the US in 2019. Breaking people's necks and permanently maiming them is fine on the battlefield, but not so much when you're in a fight in a pub or you've got someone who is just harassing you a little bit. So we need to be careful about that as well. Krav Maga has been modernized, has been adapted for the West. Probably a lot of systems have really gone too far, and they've made it soft and they've made it weak, and I've seen even some places marketing non-contact Krav Maga, which I find kind of humorous considering Krav Maga literally means contact combat. So if you're doing, I don't know what non-contact contact combat is, but it's not Krav Maga. So look, you need to have contact in there. But anyway, some systems have made it way too soft. It's become more like a Taibo aerobic fitness workout, which is great and that's fine. And it's good for fitness and that's certainly essential for your well-being, for your ability to defend yourself. But probably don't market it as self-defense if you're just teaching fitness. So Krav Maga has advantages in that it was designed for real violence. So it's simple, short, to the point. The techniques are usually quick to learn. There's normally some form of scenario replication, which is extremely important. And there's usually some sort of resisting attacker situation with role players and padded suits and that kind of jazz. So if you've got all those elements, it's positive. Where the limitation of Krav Maga is very much dependent on who's teaching it as to whether the person has any experience with real violence whatsoever, or if they're just mimicking what they've seen on YouTube or what their instructor told them, which may or may not be right. But also with Krav Maga, there is a growing percentage that make it too easy. They don't spar, they don't test their skills against people that can actually fight, and therefore they get a false sense of security. So I think if you're doing Krav Maga, you should also be plugging in some MMA training along the way so that you are training against people that know how to throw a punch, that know how to do a takedown. There's no point practicing takedown defense against someone who doesn't know how to do takedowns, because if you end up in a fight with someone who has even the remotest idea how to do takedowns, then your defenses that you've drilled aren't going to work. So you need to make sure that you are supplementing your Krav Maga training or your reality-based training with some real skills as well. So I think a combination probably works well there. Krav Maga is certainly not a bad option, but very much depends on your instructor, your school, and the style. So do your homework on that and always use the filter. Check out the podcast I recorded in season 1 on how to choose a good self-defense school. That will answer a lot of those questions for you. Okay, lastly, I'm sorry to lump these together for the purists out there. I know it's probably going to annoy a lot of people, but I'm going to put karate, taekwondo, and kung fu together. Sorry, I know it annoys me even just saying it, but otherwise we're going to end up with an hour-long episode, and I said I wasn't going to do that. So look, karate and taekwondo generally There are exceptions to this. Kyokushin karate is a notable exception, and they train full contact all the time. Although limitation is that they don't punch to the face, which is different, and it's more sportive. It's much more akin to Muay Thai in terms of its limitations. So I'll leave that out of this discussion. Kyokushin, guys, if you're considering Kyokushin, really good for mental toughness, fitness. They're hard as nails. They are just like shoe leather. And good athletes as well, and they strike with power. Pretty much the same limitations though as any sporting striking system. It's not reality, and good skills, but has its limitations. Okay, coming over to Taekwondo and majority of karate systems, so Shotokan, Goju-Ryu, etc. Again, this is probably where I have the least experience, so I take my opinion with a grain of salt on that. But I do know a lot of karate instructors. I've trained in karate for probably on and off about 2 years of my life, growing up and a little bit as an adult as well. So I do have some exposure there. I did do Taekwondo as a child. And again, I do keep in touch with the martial arts world, so I know what's going on generally. But from my observation, the limitation is that most karate instructors, most Taekwondo instructors don't have any experience with real violence. They tend to train a point-based system where it's about touch and tag and making contact, controlled contact. They're much, God, I hate to say this, they're much softer arts in that, generally speaking, most adults that are doing these arts are recreational hobbyists, and they don't want to be bruised up and they don't want to get hurt, and that's fine. It's great for fitness. But you do get a false sense of reality. Most Taekwondo and most karate schools, and I'm saying most because I know there's exceptions out there and I know you're going to blast me. Please hear me out, because if this isn't you, take it as a compliment that you're doing it right, okay? But most karate and Taekwondo schools out there don't train against takedowns. They don't train against a clinch. They don't train against resistance. They train using patterns and forms, pumse, kata. They do two-step sparring drills. Some of them may spar with contact, some of them don't. So again, very much similar to Krav Maga in a way. It depends on your instructor. You need to find the right instructor, the right club, the right culture with the right intensity to mimic something to do with reality. You'll still learn good skills. You'll still get fitter. You'll still learn to punch and kick with power. You'll probably learn good footwork and distance management, but you're going to need to do some serious supplementary work to tie that into reality with scenario-based training and some sparring, etc. So just keep that in mind with those arts. Sorry, I mentioned Kung Fu. Kung Fu can be so many different things. It's really hard to touch on. My exposure to Kung Fu was mostly with Wing Chun, and very much the same limitations as karate and Taekwondo. Wing Chun has a little bit more, has a lot more emphasis on close quarters with punching and elbows and trapping and stand-up grappling. So that does have advantages there. But again, I haven't found many Wing Chun places that actually spar properly against trained people. They certainly haven't found any that do scenario-based training with dialogue and emotional elements, etc. So those are the limitations there. You'll learn good skills, but probably not your first choice. And I just want to throw in Filipino martial arts as well. The Filipino and Indonesian martial arts and Malaysian martial arts are becoming more popular in recent years. Silat, Kali, Anis, Eskrima, etc. Really good systems. Again, good skills, the same as I just mentioned with the other martial arts. It's a really wide spectrum of versatility and applicability for these arts, and it really depends on your instructor. There tends to be a higher percentage of instructors in the Filipino martial arts that have a reality-based martial arts emphasis, which is great. So you'll generally find that you'll get some value out of it. But again, if you're missing those elements of scenario training, contact sparring, power generation, hitting moving targets, all that kind of stuff, if you're missing that, you're missing out. So again, very much depends on your instructor when it comes to those particular arts. But I would say from my limited exposure, you've got a higher percentage chance of finding a good real-world instructor in the Filipino martial arts, just because there's less of them. So check that out. It's worth a look if you've got access to it. Okay. That said, another thing about Filipino martial arts is a lot of schools are very focused on the sticks and knives because, well, that's what those martial arts are known for. Just be mindful, if you live in Australia and the UK, you're probably not carrying a knife, or at least you are taking your freedom into your own hands if you are carrying a knife. And most of us don't carry anything that resembles a stick either. So just be aware of that. Make sure you have a strategy in mind about how you would apply these skills if you are unarmed or just carrying your normal day-to-day objects. And I highly recommend you look into the work of Ray Floro for that. I've mentioned Ray several times on the podcast. Ray is great with improvised weapons and taking everyday objects and applying the Filipino martial arts principles in how to use them. So check out Ray's material if you get a chance to do that. Okay, so those are the majority of the answers that you'll normally get. Here's my answer. The best martial art for most people is not really a martial art. The best martial art for self-defense is to learn awareness, behavioral skills, verbal de-escalation, how to read a situation, and then have some physical combative skills. So whether it be like combatives, like urban combatives, Lee Morrison's work, whether it be Krav Maga, whether it be your sporting martial art, whatever it is that gets you out of there. And then have post-incident skills as well. So how you deal with the aftermath, knowing how adrenaline works, knowing how you're going to come down, knowing how to talk to law enforcement about it, knowing what happens if you have to go to court, being aware of your home security if you're in a situation now where there might be reprisals and comebacks. You need to be aware of all this stuff. That's what makes it self-defense. It's not just fighting, right? Fighting is different to self-defense. You need to have a full spectrum of skills to be able to manage violence. And that's why I call my podcast the Managing Violence Podcast, not the Self-Defense Podcast, not the Combatives Podcast, but Managing Violence. Managing violence is preparation, prevention, awareness, de-escalation, the actual fighting, and then the aftermath and the recovery. That's what managing violence is about, right? So you need to have all those skills. Where can I recommend you go to get all those skills? Look, trying to be unbiased here, but I know in my Krav Maga school, we teach all of that, but that's because we're purpose built for that. So it's Gendai Krav Maga. If there's a Gendai Krav Maga near you, it's Gendai Krav Maga. Check that out. Senshido, Richard Dimitri's system, very much that. Rich was one of the first to introduce me to a lot of these concepts. So if you have a Senshido instructor in your area, you'll find that material. Blauer Tactical Systems. So Rich learned a lot of his material from Tony Blauer, who I just had on the podcast. Tony's material is brilliant. Most of his instructors are awesome as well, and they will cover nearly all those components as well. So have a look at it if you go Tony Blauer, Blauer Tactical Systems or Spear System instructor near you. Where else can I send you? Lee Morrison's Urban Combatives is also top notch. So have a look at that as well. Other than that, it's trial and error to a lot of degree, guys. Everything has its advantages. I train grappling because I enjoy grappling. I train striking because I enjoy striking. I train weaponry because I enjoy weaponry. And I train my mind with verbal de-escalation scenarios and with multiple attacker drills and with understanding and growing my knowledge of human behavior and human movement so that I can read body language, I can read situations from a distance, and I can pick up on what the appropriate action will be in this particular scenario. I build on those skills every single day. And it doesn't mean I'm out there bashing a bag every single day. It's just watching people every single day. It's having communication and conversations every single day. It's watching what tone of voice and body language generates different reactions in different people. That is my martial art. And that's what I'm really passionate about at the moment, especially because I've got a busted shoulder and I can't train the way I want to train right now. My martial art at the moment is communication. So I'm really diving deep into building a communication system that is structured like a martial art. And I'm really excited to unveil that. I'm getting pretty close to a prototype, so I'll be sure to let you guys know when that's ready to go. But guys, that's probably not as short an answer as I expected to give you, but at the end of the day, every art has its benefits and every art has its limitations. Largely, it will depend upon the instructor and the club that you go to, and that is going to depend on your ability to use your filter to decide what's the best place for you. So check it out. Check out, my podcast. I think it was season 1, episode 8, maybe. Check it out. I'll try to link to it if it wasn't episode 8 of how to choose a good self-defense school. It will give you a good framework to go through, a scoring system to help you find the right place for you, to help find the right martial art for you to learn to defend yourself. All right, I hope you've enjoyed the very first Fight Bite. Thanks for tuning in, and I look forward to doing it again. I'll talk to you soon.